I sit there and I think you're sitting on a time bomb.
Mhm.
That's what these legacy cores are. And you hear of so many vendors. Just earlier today, someone was sharing with me about a payments platform that another bank we talk to sometimes uses that couldn't process payments for over a week.
She just completed a huge core transformation project at the bank. And this was something they completed earlier this year after more than a decade of working on it. So what are a couple things that you feel like the bank can now do or is thinking about that it can do uniquely to most other banks?
Despite being, like roughly the 40th largest bank, we were a top 10 PPP lender, right? So
Amazing.
we had built a better mousetrap. We now have omni-channel account opening capabilities. And very
Mhm.
soon, a customer will be able to start opening an account in the branch and finish at home, or vice versa. It was organizational changes, data cleanup, product standardization, process simplification and standardization, a lot of historical sort of M&A type work, and then many other kind of technology modernizations that other banks would have done along the way. We just pulled it into our core program.
Welcome to the Operate Podcast, where we give you a behind-the-scenes look at company building from the perspective of the builders themselves. This is how we operate.
Welcome to the Operate Podcast. I'm Kerry Ransom. Today's episode is sponsored by BankTech Ventures, the first strategic investment fund designed by the community banking industry for community bank innovation and investment. BankTech identifies leading products and technologies for community banks to make them better and works with the founders and management teams to maximize their impact on community banks and for their own businesses. If you're a bank looking to innovate and invest in your future, or a founder who wants to work with community banks, reach out to BankTech Ventures at banktechventures.com. My guest today is Kristiane Koontz, who is currently the EVP and Director of Treasury Services and Payments at Zions Bancorporation. This is a relatively new role for her, so I'm super excited to talk to her about that. And prior, she just completed a huge, what she would probably call a complete bank transformation project, but I think they call it a core transformation project at the bank. And this was something they completed earlier this year after more than a decade of working on it. Zions is one of the largest banks in the US, as many of you know, with nearly $100 billion in assets. And they're also known amongst the best banks in the US for particularly small businesses. She's helped really put them in a position to lead in technology. And there aren't that many banks that really are asserting themselves to take that position. And so I'm really excited to see what's ahead for them. And prior to that, she also worked with several other banks on transformation projects when she was at PwC. Kristiane, thank you so much for being here and joining me on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Kerry.
Absolutely. So let's start with this whole technology transformation at banks topic. You just completed this incredibly complex project. As I said, took literally more than a decade. And as I've said to you before, it's almost hard for me to even believe that's possible. So like for me and for others, why is it and what is it about legacy banking technology that makes it so hard to both replace and transform banks around it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, there's a reason that pretty much every bank is struggling with this.
Yes.
And even if you look at like the top 10 banks that seemingly have endless funding in their technology budgets, this is something that they're still struggling with today. And I think it really comes down to three reasons. One is the curse of being an early adopter. So banking was actually one of the first industries to start taking advantage of computer systems. In fact, in the early to mid 50s, banks started to move to mainframe computers to do basic bookkeeping and sort of ledger entries. So that book that you would walk into, at your branch back in the day, they actually had that paper ledger, and migrating that to computer systems. You think about in 1958, the microstrip was invented. In fact, the ABA created that standard. So if you don't know, I'm going to hide my account number here, but I got my checkbook, right? And so it is that strip at the bottom, right? That system, magnetic image character recognition. A lot of people don't even know the acronym. That was 1958, if you think about that. And then ATMs, the first ATM, I think, debuted in the late 60s. And so because there was that sort of early adoption, you do have then an older generation of computer systems that were at play. And then my second point is banks just kept layering on top of those. So, okay, first I'm going to do is create this electronic ledger. Then I'm going to create the ATM, and that's going to sort of sit on top of that. And then maybe I'll create a digital banking platform, and that's going to sit on top of that. And do you remember SMS banking when that, when that came out, and that was its own thing, right? For a long time, I had like a digital bank and an SMS bank. They were a little different, right? And we just keep sort of layering these things on. And we've never really gone back as an industry and sort of rebuilt a lot of those components. And I think the reason for that is because of the complexity of banking, right? And we're highly regulated. We support so many different industries, different needs, all sorts of financial transactions. And so everything we've done has just been this sort of incremental build, right? And technology solving those, but doing it in kind of this piecemeal way that makes it really hard to unwind and peel back the layers of the onion to replace the core in particular, right? Which is sort of like the center of the onion.
So there's still so much of this old infrastructure in place. I mean, we were together recently, and we were hearing stories of people working in their banks that, they're losing staff, not to retirement, but to literally dying, and they can't find people that understand the underlying programming languages that they have in their mainframe systems, like COBOL or whatever it may be. And to your point, most people have just been building around or on top of it. How long do you think that can persist, or where do we go? Because not everybody, to your point earlier, not everybody has the resources to even go through the next 10 years to do this.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think thankfully we're at a real inflection point in the industry where people are realizing they can't just keep layering on and building outside, that they've actually got to address the problem with the core. Even as recently as maybe 4 or 5 years ago, a lot of consultants were saying, well, let's just wrap and digitize the core, right? And you're still not addressing the underlying constraints. And so as a bank, we kept saying, just wait and see, because we think the risk of talent, of, the people that are dying off that know how to support these systems, many banks are on homegrown, or you've got some of the larger vendors in the US that are facing that same problem internally. And so I think the industry thinking over the last few years has really evolved to the direction of, we've now got to do something about this. Now, the challenge that many are up against is, there's a few, especially in the US market. I think the rest of the world has actually done a very good job of addressing this, right? They have mature players internationally. So I think it's always important to look kind of globally, because we're, especially in banking, we can be so US centric, and particularly in community banking. And so we think, well, no one else can figure it out if we haven't. And we actually really need to look internationally where they have been addressing the problem of the core, particularly like the Asian banks. Light years ahead have generally solved this and have sort of adopted next gen cores. But in the US, it really is dominated by US centric core providers, is part of the challenge. And they've got this stranglehold on the market, and they have not invested in those products. And so banks aren't seeing a lot of great alternatives domestically. And so that's where they're starting to say, well, do I need to look outside and bring an international vendor in to support us? That's what we ultimately did. There's other banks, JP Morgan and others using Thought Machine, again, not a US firm, to come in and solve the core problem that way. And then lastly, we have seen in the last, I'd say like 18 months, most of the major core vendors in the US really adopting modernization strategies to address the problem. Now, I think that's going to take them a while. They've got some catching up to do from historical underinvestment, but certainly just a lot underway and a lot that's changed in the last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess quick follow-up there. Do you think in your mind, I mean, you all, as you said, have decided to work with one of the international providers to be one of their lighthouse US customers here. Do you think the US cores will figure this out to a satisfaction of the US market?
Oh man, I mean, I think their shareholders want to know that too,
Yes,
right?
of course.
So no one has a crystal ball. I think they have a lot of catching up and a lot of investment to do. And I think what makes it very challenging for them is many of them are supporting many, many different core platforms. And even within those core platforms, different versions. And is it on-prem or is it hosted? And so the complexity of providing all of that support and needing to invest, we all know banking does not stand still. So you can't just sort of shelve those and focus on building the new. They've got to continue to invest in security and regulatory changes and just sort of, even if it's contained, very basic updates on those existing cores. And so just the complexity of managing that while trying to invest in the future product is really tough. Now, I do think the core provider that figures it out how to do that and that can really modernize a core and then give their clients an easy path to migration will be a winner, right? Because they do have built-in structural advantages, right? They've got long-term contracts in many cases. They are known entities. There is an assumed level of compliance that they have and that they bring to bear that if you're looking at an international provider, that's something that you're going to have to assess more carefully. And so they do have a hold on the market, right? And they have a lot of inertia there, but they also have a lot of challenges. And so it'll be interesting to see, there's actually over 20 core providers in the US. Many of them are smaller and unknown. People tend to focus on the largest, 4 or 5, but there are more options out there, just depending on the size of your bank.
Let's go back to the Zions project. And, we've talked a fair bit about it, and there's been some written about it as well. What do you feel like maybe isn't as well known about what all was entailed in this 10+ year journey?
Yeah, I think people hear about it, 10 years to replace your core. Like, what are you doing over there in Utah? And I think the biggest misconception is thinking that this is a software project or that this is even just a core replacement. The reason that we call this a core transformation is it really was a complete sort of business transformation around everything covering the core. And that includes a lot of capabilities that would be in a legacy core provider, some of those bolt-ons that we talked about, and maybe creating the next generation of that. So, for example, just to help kind of understand the scope of this, we had a consumer loan system, ACLS, and so we replaced that and migrated all those accounts. We then had 2 commercial loan systems, and because we had acquired a number of banks historically, we actually had a bunch of different instances of those systems running with slightly different data models. We've never done the integration of that. So we actually centralized a back office function. We called it enterprise loan operations. That was the first time we did that across all of those historical acquisitions, and then brought in our construction loan system and then our commercial loan system and migrated all that to a single platform, single data model, cleaned up a bunch of data while we did that too, right? Which a lot of loan data, people know you might need something and you're going back to loan files back in the day to try to solve that. We then moved on to deposits. And in order to do that work, you talk about the business transformation there, we had centralized some deposit operations, but we'd never standardized the procedures, right? And so every group, we had a single core system, but again, different instances for each one of our affiliates that use different procedures. So we did a big procedural standardization. We standardized all of our products going from 500 down to a little less than 100 and fewer than that in terms of on sale products, and then standardize and cleanse all of the data around that. We took our customer data and we stood up a customer master data management solution So that was external to our core. We got customer data in the core, but we've actually created a whole data governance function around how do you govern data. So you're not just cleaning it and then getting it dirty again, right? What does that look like? We created integration standards. So our core has to talk to over nearly about 100 different applications across the bank, over 500 touch points. And so we standardize the way that works. We realized as technology was evolving, we needed to pivot, in that 10-year journey along with it. So we took a year in there to build our integration fabric capabilities. So we implemented an API gateway and standardized all of that and created kind of consistent ways of integrating systems across the bank. We looked at our account opening functions. And so we actually ended up taking our digital solution for account opening, and we ended up building that as our branch solution for account opening. And as a result of that, we now have omni-channel account opening capabilities, right? And very soon, a customer will be able to start opening an account in the branch and finish at home, or vice versa, and obviously banker assisted as well. So those are just some of the examples, our teller platform, but you can see here it was organizational changes, data cleanup, product standardization, process simplification and standardization, a lot of historical sort of M&A type work, and then many other kind of technology modernizations that other banks would have done along the way. We just pulled it into our core program so that we were really doing that intentionally. I'll also mention we replaced every digital customer front end at the bank while we were doing this as well. It was a concurrent effort, but a very intentional one alongside our core.
That's a lot. That is amazing. I mean, one of the things that one of your key business partners, Scott, who's the president of the bank, talked about was how you just had to have this sort of resolute belief that this was the right thing to do. And, having that kind of support and leadership is so key and unique. I'm curious, so with that, how does the bank think about near-term and long-term ROI in that respect? Like, there obviously are a ton of savings that are realized, reducing some of the duplicative or variance in some of these systems that you're managing. But as you look ahead, are there key areas that you think about the bank says, okay, here's where we really think we're going to drive, major return on this big investment?
Yeah, well, I just will double down on having the executive leadership support all the way from the CEO to the president on down was instrumental. We simply could not have done this without a real strong commitment from our leadership that this was the right path. And some of this, I'll just say, was non-negotiable, right? I mean, we saw this as an existential risk. And I talked to a lot of banks that say, well, core conversion, like that's inherently very risky, and I don't want to take down the bank. And I sit there and I think, you're sitting on a time bomb. That's what these legacy cores are. And you hear of so many vendors of, just earlier today, someone was sharing with me about a payments platform that another bank we talked to sometimes uses that couldn't process payments for over a week. There's a Treasury internet banking provider recently that had a week-long outage for its multi-tenant customers. Some of these other cores would have just huge availability issues. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. You think about the Southwest meltdown is a good sort of analogy, and some of the Delta problems haven't been as well publicized, but the airline industry is very similar in some of their systems to what the banking industry relies on. And we've seen many of us as travelers and consumers, the impacts of that. So one is, ROI is important, and I'll talk to that, but this is sort of existential level things that you just got to address as a bank.
Well, don't you think, before you go to that, don't you think that we're going to be in a place where a number of banks are going to say, we just don't have the stomach for this, Kristiane? So here, take our bank, take our customers, put it on your platform, and
well,
going.
And
now you're in that place, right?
And that's something that we could do, right? That is theoretically a business model that we could support. And we've certainly heard interest from other community banks. We obviously provide correspondent banking services already to over 200 other community banks. So like when I describe Zions, I say, hey, we're like a community bank at scale, right? Because we provide all of the back end platform and infrastructure, and then we have these unique brands. And so is that a model? If we're really passionate about community banking, which I am, you think about jobs creation and small businesses and what's really the heartbeat of the economy. And community banks are central to that mission. And so I think you will see more community banks potentially gravitating towards that model. And then obviously we're in a giant trend of consolidation. And, I think many are about 4,000 banks in the US right now, and many predictions that that's going to continue to whittle down. And so I think you'll see banks joining forces, and sometimes it'll be a generational change and simply not having the stomach to go through the technology transformation. That I'm not saying all banks have to do that, but you certainly have to be thinking about your risks, cybersecurity, and then just the kind of core platforms risk that you have, even if you're not trying to do something fancy. You might say I'm a pretty simple bread and butter kind of bank, but there's a number of risks out there that have to be addressed.
Absolutely. Well, and it is, you can't delay it forever, because then you're just going to be so uncompetitive from what you're able to offer and do.
Absolutely. So I see that. What I don't think is an accurate narrative, and sometimes people misunderstand this, I don't think that this inherently means that the only banks that are going to be successful in the future are the top 20 banks. I firmly believe you can be very successful if you are strategic. And in fact, with the direction that technology is going, I think it is democratizing technology access for community banks. So sometimes I talk to folks and say, oh, community banking, business model at risk. And yes, there are headwinds, but there's actually so many of the things that make community banks a really strong business model remain. And then the technology access is getting better if you're innovative, if you're strategic about it, right? And so I certainly wouldn't want anyone to hear that and think, oh, well, the writing's on the wall for community banks, because that's not my message at all.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's not just about you have to get bigger, to your point.
Exactly.
You have to be clear in the vision of who you are and what you're going to do. And the cost of technology, the beautiful thing is it does continue to go down. And so and I think AI is just this next wave of democratization, to your point.
Absolutely.
So give me a sense of, what are a couple things that you feel like the bank can now do or is thinking about that it can do uniquely to most other banks now that you're on the other side of this?
Yeah. Well, so you asked about ROI, and I wasn't trying to dodge the question there. So obviously, we just have a more efficient operating model in place now, being on the other side of this. So that was kind of a given. But then looking forward, like what we're really focused on, well, what else can and will we do? One of the things that we got inherently is this is a real-time system. And so that is real time, not just for things like funds availability, which is important, although a lot of banks mostly make that happen through memo posting today. But this means, real time for things like exceptions processing and non-financial transactions, right? So you walk into, if you go behind the teller desk in any branch in the US at any bank, you're going to find all these little Post-it notes that they have written themselves to go check something the next day and make sure that whatever update they made for a customer posted correctly, because these batch systems post overnight and then they can see it the next day. All of that has gone away for us. Our customers absolutely love it. They can see those changes reflected in real time. It's minimized errors, right? We've got much better sort of data entry control anyways with a system like this, but even where things, someone makes a mistake, they don't have to do these little follow-ups. Customers can see it. Another thing is just the speed at which we can deliver new products and solutions to our customers is materially faster going forward. We've cleaned our house. It's kind of like, I don't know, trying to cook dinner when you've got a bunch of dirty pots and pans all over your kitchen. It's like, you need a clean workspace. And so we have cleaned all of that up. And then just the speed with this system, a good example would be PPP. So when PPP came out, we were able to fully develop and launch our PPP lending product within 3 days. That's all the testing on the core, the application process, and then API boarding onto the core, right? So fully streamlined. We use our API gateway that we had just invested in to, submit those applications in. And so despite being, like roughly the 40th largest bank, we were a top 10 PPP lender, right?
Amazing.
So we had built a better mousetrap. So that's just one example of how much faster we can go now to execute against opportunities. And then the last thing I would highlight is around data. And so having our data at our fingertips, fraud is such a big topic right now. And the amount that we can do combining really good data with real-time capabilities to combat fraud is incredible. In fact, we've seen reductions in operational losses because of the capabilities that we have, and we're exploring more ways to do that and just leverage data and real time for error prevention and personalization back to our customers.
Great examples. Thank you. How has that affected the spirit of the team? Like, do you feel like now people being able to ship something in 3 days versus 3 months or a year is a totally different energy enabler to a team? So do you see just a more confident and creative team now?
I'm so glad you asked that question. It is just amazing. I'll walk into any branch and hear like, oh my gosh, I love this. And sometimes I'll say, I came from a bigger bank and this is better than what they had, right? And at first when I came, I wasn't sure if I was going to stay, but this is amazing, right? So that was kind of set of reactions. Number one was just how much easier it is for our people to serve our customers now, right? And they're not focused on navigating systems and clicking through a bunch of, often it was 3 or 4 systems that they might have to look at to complete something for a customer. So that was sort of reaction number one. And now we're on wave 2, which is what you described around there's a real momentum and a real sense of excitement because things are getting done, right? And we're continuing to deliver enhancements and new products and value to production. So we're on the cusp of a few other launches here, including some related to how we're opening accounts digitally in the small business space. So just a lot of excitement for the speed with which we can go that we've never been able to run that fast.
Yeah, I think it's just so virtuous too, right? You like once that momentum starts to build and then the word gets out amongst people and customers, and I just think there's such a continued potential momentum that can build, particularly when you're competing against others. And
absolutely,
I hold up my iPhone all the time in front of bankers and say, your biggest challenge, I think, is now you have to fight a battle on 2 fronts. Not only are your customers' expectations changing because of this mobile device, but so are your employees. And most people don't want to feel like they're going back in time to go to work. And that now you have, not only do you have a competitive advantage with customers, I would argue you have it with talent too, which is a big, big challenge.
So our bankers can now access our core system on their iPads. Think about that. Like, just think about a banker going and sitting down with the customer. And we previously enabled them with iPads and all sorts of access, but to be able to even access the core and just see things about a customer out in the field, it's been just really transformative for our workforce.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I mentioned this earlier at the beginning. You've taken a little bit of in some respects, a narrower but slightly different role now, focusing on a particular product and area of value, which I'm sure has been fun just to change things up. How do you feel like you're leveraging that broader sense of the bank and all the transformation you helped lead in this role?
Yeah, well, I think so. My role in Treasury, so I have our Treasury services and then I have our payments strategy, which touches everything in the bank, right? And payments are so core to what a bank does. So I really see this as, I've almost always had the buyer be sort of IT or transformation type executives and trying to do transformation within a transformation office or within tech. And so this is an opportunity to actually go transform inside the business, right?
Yeah.
By leading a business unit through this kind of transformation, building on everything that we did from our core. And obviously treasury and payments are two areas that we're going to be investing in quite a bit now that we've tackled the problem with the core. So treasury, cash management, right? Information reporting. So all of that sort of fits in that wheelhouse. And then I think there's just a lot of really exciting things that we can do from a payments perspective that we're now starting to explore.
Are you taking this idea of, I mean, you talk about transformation. Are you taking that idea to key customers and saying, let us help you rethink how our bank fits in your business? And that's transformative as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that we're really focused on is getting closer to the customer, right? So in the treasury space in particular, for a long time, the solutions might be like, well, here's a remote deposit capture scanner, and you could just plug that in and you're good to go. And nowadays, what we're really doing is embedding much more deeply within our clients' processes. So it's a much more complex business, but it's also one that allows the bank to add so much more value.
That's right.
In terms of operational efficiency and insight for our customers. And so I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of what that looks like. But I'm really excited for the prospects there, because I think for a long time, the narrative was, ERP banking, for example, you're going to disintermediate your customer relationship. And I think that's a risk, but I think there's also an opportunity with all of this that we can actually embed, much more deeply in those customers and make us much stickier and much more valuable to them.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, part of how I'm a big customer psychology person, and I say, in this day and age, if your answer is you come to the bank on our terms when you need us, you're going to lose, because we have so much change that's happened in every area of our life where we now control so much more of that experience and decision that the bank should be able to come to me and meet me where I am, when and where I want it. And so I think when you do that well, you're going to be super sticky, to your point. And
absolutely.
Yeah. So,
well, and I think our customers seeing that we've done this core transformation gives us credibility.
Yeah, for sure.
Because they've seen this journey. They knew that we went through this change. We actually recently hosted an innovation week at our technology campus in Utah as well. And we invited some of those customers in, and their reactions were just incredible. I thought, oh my gosh, we need to have more customers here. So we're going to do that next year with this innovation week. But for them to see that their community bank is on the forefront of innovation, right? I mean, that's just, so you've got the service side that the big banks can't match. And then we can go toe to toe on the technology side of things. It's just such a winning proposition.
Yeah. Part of what's gotten me so excited about being in this space at this time is it is so clear that the best of banking is this great combination of high tech and high touch. And, you all have that at a size of bank that most don't. And that's also exciting to see.
Thank you.
So you think about, I mean, you mentioned earlier, you all ended up with a partner who had not had a lot of history of delivering software here in the US, and they had some international success and customers. As you think about these key vendor and partners to Zions, but also just banks in general, how do you think about what that mix of key strategic partners should look like?
That's a very good question. I mean, the things that I look for in a strategic partner, you've obviously got to have the product capabilities, but more importantly, you've got to have the delivery capability, the kind of relationship and customer support, and then the ongoing investment in the product, right? So the last thing, and some of that comes down to ownership structure then of the company as well. So if we actually assess the financials of the technology partners that we implement, particularly if it's a critical system or a large investment. And so, we ask ourselves, like, what are the chances that this company is going to get bought, right? What are the chances that, do they have the sophistication to manage cybersecurity? Are they going to be able to continue to invest in the roadmap for this product so that it evolves with the time, the feature functionality continues to invest. Now, sometimes you have a narrow need and you've got a great partner that's going to fit. And maybe it's simple enough, that in 12 months or 36 months, you can replace them, and that's just fine. But for some of these kind of like strategic platforms, we're really thinking a lot about platforms. That's where you've got to make sure that you've got all of those components in the relationship, right? It's not just the feature functionality and the tech that absolutely has to be there, but there's these other dimensions as well that go into that partnership.
That's super helpful. Thank you for sharing that. I like your vision for focusing on platforms. What I've at least experienced so far in the last few years in all the companies that we've been meeting through BankTech, I'm finding the vast majority of the most interesting companies right now, at least to help banks, are a little bit more best of breed products, maybe a little bit more in that 12 to 36 month clear value proposition. They solve a key problem. Today, we talk a lot about bank ready or shovel ready today with a future proofed at least foundation. So they're going to still be relevant, but can they become a platform over time? And I'm not sure we have a lot of really good next generation platforms yet for banking. I'm excited to see in the years to come some of those start to emerge. So I'm curious your thoughts. Like, do you feel like there are some really high quality ones worth taking the leap and risk on, or do you think we're still early to what the best, highest value platforms will be 5-10 years from now?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some good ones emerging that are more in like the IT management space, not as much sort of the business of banking space, right? And seeing broad platforms there. But there are some companies that are specializing in like creating the digital foundation that you might plug a lot of, other things into. And so, I generally just don't mention vendors by name, right? But I think that's a space that's ripe of like, could you be the platform to be the digital ecosystem, for a bank and plug in all of these other best of breed. So I think that's a really wise play. And then I think, Carrie, you actually wrote something recently on LinkedIn that totally resonated, which is around having hooks into other platforms, right? And so some of these point solutions, the easier it is, and this is absolutely true, the easier your product is, your solution is to integrate in with other platforms that a customer is already using, the better off you'll be, right? You've got those adjacencies, and then you're creating an environment that makes a potential acquisition really attractive as well. And so I think that could be a good strategy for some of those banks. One of the headwinds is vendor management at a bank is cumbersome. We're subject to a lot of regulatory scrutiny, and there's a lot of complexity in that. And so banks are trying to rationalize the number of vendors they use. And sometimes we see, especially for us as a larger bank, we sometimes see a great technology solution that we want, but unless it's like so many light years ahead or some really critical business need, sometimes it's simply not worth the added complexity to integrate if there's something that's going to almost get us there, or even we're kind of back. There's this pendulum that swings and buy versus build in the banking industry. And we were very much I think the pendulum, when I started my career, everyone had sort of built, the pendulum swung to buy. I think the pendulum is now kind of swinging back, and maybe it's a little bit of a happy medium of what you want to build and what you want to buy. And so it's a very long-winded way of saying that, I think you got to put yourself in a bank's shoes and think about your value prop, and can you partner with one of these platform providers or be the platform provider, right? And if not, I think your lifespan and your addressable market is going to be a little bit more limited.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I mean, the other thing I struggle with at times is the solution provider may be a really useful solution, but it might not be the entire solution that the bank needs.
Exactly.
And so now all of a sudden they're looking at, we may need to piece together 3 or 4 companies to actually deliver the internal operational solution end to end, or the customer experience end to end, or entire life cycle. And I think that creates challenges, particularly for smaller banks that maybe don't have the team to do that work, to both identify and implement that
Yes.
to fully realize it. And so that's been an interesting just reality of being in this for the last few years.
Absolutely. Yeah, we spend a lot of time thinking about unified customer experiences in particular. And so earlier in my career, for example, I did a lot of work in the mortgage space, and everyone wanted to create these mortgage specific apps and solutions. I said, hold on.
Yeah.
This mortgage customer also has their checking account with you and a credit card. And so do you really think they want a single login for mortgage and then another login for these other things, right? And so kind of creating those unified client experiences or finding ways to stitch those together, I think is really important.
Super important. I think that is an early emergent topic too, where I'm finding more banks at least awakening to, we need to actually understand the customer side of this journey and what they're experiencing, because again, it's somewhat the iPhone effect of, I've had these really good ones in other areas of life. How do I reimagine that inside of a banking context? So I'm excited to hear you say that, because I feel like that is very fertile ground to mine or farm in the next few years.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about your peers. I loved your example earlier of somebody being able to maybe start an account opening in a branch because that's where they started, but then deciding to finish at home, or ideally more people are probably not even willing to get off their couch and do this. They want to do it entirely. And so I tend to just think about banking as a wholly digital business. And not everyone's there yet, but it's clearly moving that direction. This isn't like, I grew up in a lumber business. We're moving weight around. Like, banks aren't really moving weight around for the most part today. And yet not everybody's there. And so they've accepted the paper process, in some cases continuing. And, you all have clearly accepted that and invested heavily in it. How are you either engaging or inspiring your colleagues who maybe just don't fully have their head wrapped around what that means and what the full digitization of their business will enable to help them even see the urgency and see the need to make that transformation?
Yeah, well, I mean, our goal is to make it easy for a customer to engage with us the way they want to engage with us. And so that is not to replace a banker with an iPad necessarily, but that's to let customers self-service when they want to, right? And particularly kind of low value activities, it's great for us if they want to serve digitally, and we need to make that available to them. By the way, we're not perfect on that yet. That's something that we obviously are continuing to invest in.
A lot of banks, I mean, they've kind of said, well, we're letting customers do that, but we've got a bunch of people behind the curtain moving paper around, so they don't have to. And like, that's okay for a minute, but ultimately it doesn't scale and it breaks.
Yeah, it doesn't scale, it breaks. Someone goes on vacation, you get a power outage, or and sometimes that's part of the innovation process. If you remember Rocket Mortgage, I actually feel bad giving this example, but Rocket Mortgage made a really big deal about how they had digitized the process. And so I actually decided to try it out, and someone attempted to collect the IRLA from me using unsecured chat questions, asking every single question that was in the loan application. And that was not a digital process, right? Sure, it was, someone was typing with me to get the information, but it was a pretty poor, user experience. Now what they did, they gradually kind of created the real version of that, right? Or you look at, it turned out that Amazon and the sort of walk out the store approach, that wasn't some magic with RFID. That was actually a bunch of humans watching watching the videos to charge you for it, which is actually kind of impressive in its own right.
That's right.
Certainly not scalable. And so, I think some of that is like, innovation isn't always linear. And so I think it's just clearly you've got to be conscious though. Is this something that you're doing as a building block to get to a fully automated digital solution and maybe prove out like proof of value and proof of concept? So is this really the right thing to do? Should I invest in this? That's that's when you should do that. And I think that's what Amazon was doing there, was that was the cheapest, fastest way to prove a value for them. But yeah, you gotta find ways to build in the operational kind of scale that you need. I think what a lot of banks struggle with, especially some of the smaller banks, is it's just very hard to be proactive because the capacity simply doesn't exist to actually build the tech to do what they're trying to do. We share our story quite a bit. We had our industry day that you joined us at earlier this month, where we told our story to many other banks, and we participate in peer exchanges where we learn a lot from other banks as well that maybe have thought more about some topics than we have, and we've shared with them. But that is where I think some of the, whether it's RPA or generative AI, those technologies are really going to come into play in the near term, just to help build some of that connectivity where it's like duct taped and super glued together operationally behind the scenes to make the appearance of a digital front end work.
That's right. Well, and that's where, capacity is such a key concept there that you shared, because most banks run pretty efficient, lean operations on a day-to-day basis. And then you say, okay, in addition to all you do every day, you need to also be a part of this transformation effort. It's no wonder it's just slight incremental improvement, because people can't allocate 50% or 80% of their time to that. It just doesn't work, right? And I mean, part of obviously why your group was so successful was this lift out and completely dedicated team. And so that may be something more banks need to really be thoughtful about. How do you, in the short term, maybe you have to become a little bit less profitable and make that investment. I mean, I'm typically more comfortable with that as an investor in early stage companies, where you have to subsidize that build to, recover that later in the future. And most operating companies, and particularly banks, just don't operate that way.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. And I think banks would really benefit from thinking about certain things as having some startup costs.
That's right.
Right. And maybe it is making we talk a lot about continuous improvement, but there's not always the capacity to do that within an existing function. And so in targeted strategic areas, where can you think about this like it is a new, right? And I'm going to build it new and differently. And so I'm going to incur some startup costs to get there, but with a promise on a return, at some point.
Yeah. So good. Well, with the time we have left, I'd love to go a little bit deeper into you. We've talked so much high level, and I've had just such enjoyment getting to know you over the last year. As I said earlier, you were doing transformation projects with PwC. You started working on the project at Zions and then decided to go in-house. What was it about going in-house that drew you in? Because there is some enjoyment to going project to project that a lot of people do have, and you've done it successfully for quite a while.
Yeah, and I love my consulting career, right? And getting to come in, and I used to feel like I could make more of an impact as a consultant. I would, and it's a very high growth way to sort of manage your career, because you're always learning something new. And I got to a point where I realized at Zions, I could have more of an impact going in-house, right? And it became that kind of pivot point where I realized I can control more spend. I can build the culture that you just can't build as a consultant, that I thought we needed around kind of innovation and transformation. And I could be there for that team as their leader. And so that was really what drew me, was ultimately, and we have terrific leadership team and group of people to work for and learn from. And I think just kind of a really valuable franchise that I was joining. So all of that was part of the calculus. But I think ultimately on a personal level, it was the ability to make a bigger impact.
That's awesome. Well, now looking back, then on those several years that you've been there, what do you feel like was maybe different about the project than you anticipated? And what do you feel like you've learned most about yourself?
I think just in transformation broadly, I used to think, especially as a consultant, I could come up with the perfect thing, the perfect way of doing something, and just hand it over. Here, I fixed it, take it and run with it, right? And, what I've learned is that couldn't be further from the truth. Like change management is a very human process. And so particularly as you work on more complex and kind of deeper changes to operating models, people have to come along the journey with you, and it has to be their idea. They have to co-create the solution. You can't just create it and hand it over, right? And so that kind of collaborative process and bringing people along was really part of it, and making sure that our teams were poised to do that. And so I'd say that was a really key thing.
What would you say are your top core values as a leader? I mean, you had such a big group that you had to both manage and influence through this. I'm curious, I'm sure in talking to some of your colleagues, they would share is that everybody has such positive things to say about you, but what do you consider your key leadership values?
Personally, as a leader, it's about empowering your team. And so that is creating an environment where they can thrive and they can get the work done, right? And so that is creating structures that empower them to make decisions, and then providing them support when they need help, right? When they need resources, providing constructive challenge, all of those things that will really empower them to get the work done. And then what I focus on with my team in terms of our guiding principles, we had 5 actually in our program, and I won't share them verbatim, but they were around collaboration. And so really working together as a team. It didn't matter what your job was, right? It was our collective job as a group and the work that we had to get done. It was a sense of urgency and not letting perfect be the enemy of good, right? Is being a really big one. End-to-end thinking and being forward thinking. So not thinking about just your piece of the process, but really end-to-end, how is something going to work? So those were some of the key values that we had as a team that really helped us to be successful.
Really good ones. I like to also ask people about rituals that they have. When someone has gotten to the level you have, usually there have been some things that have served you well along the way. Are there any key disciplined approaches or rituals that you have that you find really serve you well?
Yeah, I have a few. The one that my team knows probably the best is that I keep a very rigorous to-do list. And it's sort of my personal to-dos. It's the things that I'm watching and maybe just some of the things that I'm thinking about. And I can organize it across different domains, but I always have on one piece of paper that I can pull out, like, here's the universe of what I'm thinking about and managing so that nothing slips through the cracks. And so I review and I rewrite those. It's not always about checking things off the list. I mean, these lists might persist for 2 months before I totally rewrite the next one. So these are longer lasting sort of thematic items and pieces of work that are on this kind of, it's like a 1-page. So that's one. And then I think the other is I make sure that I take time away just to reflect. I spend a lot of time just like trying to think, like, what could go wrong? What is a better way to approach this? Who's not involved? Who should be? What are the blockers going to be to getting this thing done? And so whether it's just going for a walk, and kind of sometimes I'll go for a walk in the day, early in the morning or at night, and just thinking through that, but having that reflection time, right? That not everything is kind of focused on real direct output is important. And I kind of do a little mini version of that at the beginning of each week. I kind of think about like, well, what do I really need to accomplish this week? What is most important for moving the needle? And then I think about it every morning and say, for today, what are the top 3 things that I'm going to feel good at the end of the day if those got done, right? So it's just those real kind of intentional at different time horizons, sort of making time for that thinking.
Oh, it's so good. Well, thank you for sharing those. I know this is a collection over the many podcast conversations I've had. It's just so rich, and that's helpful. Well, last thing, I know just who you are. You love imparting and sharing your experience and wisdom with others. I feel like the world of work, particularly in banking, is going to look a lot different in 5 to 10 years even than it does today. So you think about advice you would give to people just joining Zions or just joining banking today as far as how to best invest in themselves and their career? What advice would you have for those new folks today?
Yeah, I mean, two things. One is never stop learning, right? I mean, so much of our job changes every 5 or 10 years. And so just that investment and that skill of learning is really important. And then I would say the other thing is really make sure that you understand the business of banking. If that's the business that you want to be in, how things are done might change. And in fact, the business itself is going to continue to evolve, but you ultimately have to understand the why, right? Like, what are we doing for the customer and how do we create value for the bank out of that? And if you understand that, you can go and kind of understand different departments, move from job to job, procedures could change, et cetera. And sometimes people get way too hung up in a procedure or a policy. And it's like, really think about what we're trying to do here, right? And I think if you keep that as a North Star, you'll be well set.
Oh, that's great. Well, Kristiane, thank you so much. Such a fun conversation. And I'm glad we could find some time to get our schedules aligned and actually record it. And as I've said, it's been so fun to get to know you over this last year, and congrats on the amazing transformation, not just of the core, but of the entire business at Zions, and excited to see what's ahead.
I've loved our time together. So thank you so much, Carrie.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Operate Podcast. If you like this conversation, as a favor to me, you can rate us, review us, or subscribe, or tell your friends. You can also reach out to us on Twitter at Operate Podcast. Until next week, get out there and operate.